Hello, I'm the awesome tutor, and today we're looking at economic growth and GDP as a measure of economic growth or standard of living. We're going to look at the causes of economic growth and the effects and consequences. So, what is the definition of economic growth? Economic growth is an increase in real GDP, okay? And it can also be defined as a long-term expansion of the productive potential of the economy. What is GDP? That is a key definition you need to know. It is a total of all the economic activity in a country, regardless of where the assets are located. Okay? And by economic activity, we mean the monetary value of all the goods and services produced within the country in a specified time period. GNI and GNP, for your exam, you don't need to know the distinction between them, but the definition that connects them, because they are quite similar, is the total income earned by a country's factors of production regardless of where the assets are located. Okay? For GDP, it's regardless of who owns the assets. So it could be in a different country, all right? You have so it could be a foreign business within your country, and that's generating economic activity, and that is measured in GDP. For GNI/GNP, no, it's the opposite. GNP can also be defined by this equation, the gross domestic product plus the net property income from abroad. Okay? And GDP per capita, it looks at it on an individual scale, so on average what each person is producing in the economy. It's measured, it's defined or calculated by the real total GDP over the population. Now, the big thing you need to know for your exam for GDP is the distinction between real GDP and nominal GDP. Real GDP means that it's adjusted for inflation, okay? Where nominal GDP is not, right? It's at current prices, okay? So for example, in an economy, if there is high inflation, that may increase the value of the nominal GDP, but that does not necessarily mean that the country is experiencing actual sustainable economic growth. Okay, that's why we use real GDP, which is a more accurate measure, okay, because it takes into account inflation. And real GDP is calculated by nominal GDP minus the inflation rate. Okay, you also need to know some limitations of GDP as a measure of economic growth and the standard of living. Okay, there could be inaccuracies, right? It's hard to measure all the economic activity in a country because there's so much. Okay, stuff might be under-recorded or even not recorded at all. Okay, and the GDP does not take into account external costs of economic growth, such as pollution or excessive use of fossil fuels. Okay, and also it does not really take into account the quality of life. Okay, for example, if you're working very, very, very long hours, okay, the GDP does not take that into account. You just need to know maybe 2 or 3 points. Next. Okay, so what are the causes of economic growth? We have short-term, we have long-term. For short-term, we have demand-side growth. So any increase in the components of aggregate demand, such as investment, consumption, net exports, or government spending, that will increase aggregate demand and shift it to the right, increasing output, causing economic growth. A decrease in the cost of production will mean that output goes up from Y to Y1, but also prices decrease. Okay, so aggregate supply increases from AS to AS1, shifting to the right or downwards, but just say to the right. It's because of the Keynesian diagram. Right? If you want to draw it neoclassical, we have the price level, we have output, we have aggregate demand, and we have aggregate supply. It shifts to the right because there's a decrease in the cost of production, so output goes from Y to Y1. Okay? It depends on your preference, neoclassical or Keynesian. So, any kind of demand side shock or supply side shock as well, what are those? They are rapid sizable, unpredictable changes in aggregate demand or aggregate supply. So they will rapidly increase aggregate supply or aggregate demand, causing demand side growth and supply side growth in terms of cost of production. Also policies, maybe we have demand side policies such as fiscal or monetary, expansionary, okay, which will shift AD to the right, okay, as well as supply side policies for long term, okay. Now supply side growth, okay, it can be shown by an increase in long run aggregate supply from LRAS to LRAS1. Okay, also you can use a PPF, production possibility frontier, because remember, a shift in the PPF to the right illustrates economic growth. Okay, so when we talk about this aggregate demand, aggregate supply diagram now, because the productive potential of the economy increases, okay, so that requires an increase in the quality or quantity of the factors of production, so land, labor, capital, enterprise, that will shift aggregate supply to the right, okay, increasing productive capacity, and that increases growth, okay, because output goes up from Y to Y1. Now, if aggregate demand does not keep up with supply, so for example, if it's here, there's a lot of spare capacity, it's a huge negative output gap, and that will mean there will be a lot of excess supply, okay, and that's never good. So there are some disadvantages and evaluation points you can use. Okay, also here, if aggregate demand is at potential, okay, and it increases, it's not going to increase growth. It's just going to cause inflation. Okay? So, let's move on. Okay, so what are the constraints on growth? If a country has poor infrastructure, roads for example, if it doesn't have sufficient roads, then transportation of goods and services will be very difficult. So there'll be a high cost of production, and also hinders the productive capacity of the economy. You're also less likely to attract foreign direct investment, which helps with economic growth. Also, if the infrastructure in the country is very poor, okay, it's going to be hard for people to get to schools, for example. So education standards decrease, and the skill of your labor force also decreases, and that also constrains and restricts economic growth. Low capital investment or inadequacy of capital markets. You need capital for economic growth. You need it to produce goods and services. Okay, so if you have low capital investments or inadequate capital markets, then aggregate demand will be restricted, and so will long-run aggregate supply and productive potential. If you have a savings gap, low savings in the economy affects investment, because you need savings, the bank needs savings to lend out to firms and businesses to invest. Inappropriate regulation, so poor policy making by the government, that may lead to government failure, leading to a net welfare loss in the economy, and that may have a huge negative impact on growth and productive potential maybe. So, availability and quality of factors of production. Okay, so in general, you need good factors of production in order to have good economic growth. Predominantly labor and capital, these are the main ones. You need a good labor force, you need good quality of capital to produce goods and services, to increase production, to increase productivity, to increase growth. Next, so what are the benefits and costs of economic growth? Higher living standards, okay, because with an increase in economic growth, there's going to be an increase in real incomes. Okay. So people have higher incomes, so they can buy the basic necessities, poverty reduces, etc., etc., etc. Increased profits for businesses and firms, so that's good for them. Fiscal dividend, so effects on the government, okay, because more people are now employed, okay, because economic growth increases, and they need more workers now. Tax revenues for the government goes up, okay. And because now less people are unemployed, the government does not have to pay as much welfare or unemployment benefits. Okay, so now the government will have a budget surplus, or their budget deficit might decrease. Okay, so they can spend more money on stuff like merit goods or public goods, which will benefit the economy and have positive externalities. Okay, as I said, unemployment decreases, which is good, and there's also an accelerator effect. An increase in growth causes more increases in growth, because with more growth you need more investment. And more investment means more growth. The costs of economic growth. Inflation, depending on what type of economic growth it is and the spare capacity in the economy. So let me just draw you an example diagram. If aggregate demand increases from AD to AD1, and there is a lot of spare capacity in the economy, so there's a negative output gap, that will increase prices from P to P1, as well as increasing output and economic growth from Y to Y1. Okay? So there is a policy trade-off and a conflict of macroeconomic objectives. Might have adverse environmental effects, so if you are overproducing to cause economic growth, there may be an increase in pollution or excessive use of fossil fuels, expansion of land, businesses, etc., 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 which may have a negative environmental impact. Okay? The balance of payments. I'm going to explain this a little bit. Okay, so if growth increases, real incomes go up, right? For the most part. So consumers will start buying more imports. Alright? And that means that this is going to worsen the trade balance. And the trade balance is a huge component of the current account. So this may lead to a current account deficit, okay, which is bad for the balance of payments. Also, with an increase in economic growth, businesses might import more, right? They need resources and commodities and raw materials from abroad to increase production. So that will also increase imports. Inflation, as I said, that will also decrease the competitiveness of exports. So your exports might decrease. And that will also worsen the trade balance. Okay? That's economic growth. This has been the Awesome Tutor. Bye.